The history of a people and nation is not confined to the geographical boundaries of any political entity. As such, the history of China and the Chinese people goes far beyond the contemporary considerations of Chinese history, limited to the borders of the Chinese nation. In this documentary, I seek to expand the understanding of the Chinese experience and focus on the stories of those communities and individuals which decided to leave their homeland behind. In the limited time that I have, I wish to share and explore the experiences and history of the Chinese people that immigrated to the United States during the latter part of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. Here, during a time of political, cultural, and social discrimination, I seek to demonstrate how Chinese American immigrants during the Exclusion era exemplified courage, community, and long-suffering in the face of hate and resistance. Prior to the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, there was already prevalent anti-Chinese sentiment on the American West Coast. The state of California attempted to pass legislation to block Chinese immigration as early as 1858, though the law was declared unconstitutional shortly thereafter. American sentiment was turned against these immigrants following two major events in American history. Firstly, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, and secondly, the Californian Gold Rush. From 1865 to 1869, the population of Chinese laborers made up as much as 90% of the laborers working on the railroad. Limited employment opportunities and language capabilities meant that the Chinese laborers were willing to accept lower wages than their local American counterparts. This meant that while the railroads were more inclined to hire Chinese laborers, they were exploited by their employers and looked down on by the majority of American workers as threats to their own employment. This same issue repeated during the Californian Gold Rush. Mass immigration from the American East to West Coast was also accompanied by increased immigration from the Chinese East to the American West. Once again, mining companies were motivated to purchase cheap Chinese labor, and the same issues developed. Californian lawmakers and representatives began pushing back against Chinese workers and immigration. The first attempt in 1858 failed, but further efforts gradually swayed public opinion and national opinion. H. N. Clement, a Californian lawyer, described the threat during a discussion at the Californian legislature in 1876 in the following words: "The Chinese are upon us. How can we get rid of them? The Chinese are coming. How can we stop them? They are an evil and imminent, unarmed invasion of immigrants." Following the railroad and gold rush, public opinion shifted quickly against Chinese workers, and legislation on the national level was soon passed. First, the Page Act of 1875 targeted the exclusion of prostitutes, polygamists, and Chinese laborers. All three of those groups were associated with the Chinese immigrant population during the legislative discussions in Congress. Then, in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. The act banned Chinese immigrants from going through the American naturalization process, meaning that they could never become citizens. The act was also focused on class restrictions because while it banned the immigration of Chinese laborers, it also permitted limited immigration from merchants, diplomats, and teachers. 10 years later, the act was renewed in perpetuity with the Gary Act of 1892. After the 1882 Exclusion Act was passed, American lawmakers found the need to detain Chinese immigrants as they continued to make their way across the Pacific. Despite the legal discrimination, immigrants still made their way over for greater social and economic opportunity. The solution to the issue of continued immigration was found in a small island off the coast of San Francisco. Angel Island, a name alluring to a paradise, became a prison for Chinese immigrants from 1910 until 1940. When Angel Island was opened as an immigration center, it was represented by the local newspapers as the Ellis Island of the West. While Ellis Island was used for decades as an arrival point for thousands of American families, Angel Island was used only for 3 decades. The entire time, it was a detention center. With 1 in 6 immigrants being deported back to Asia, Angel Island saw the highest rejection rate of America's immigration centers over its short history. Some immigrants managed to utilize the American legal system to escape the island quickly. However, most were held there for months. The most remarkable legacy of Angel Island is the poetry that detained immigrants carved into the walls of the buildings. Many lamented leaving home, others wished for a better future, while yet others reflected on the terrible conditions of their detention. I ate wind and tasted waves for more than 20 days. Fortunately, I arrived safely on the American continent. I thought that I would land in a few days. How would I know that I would become a prisoner suffering in a wooden building? There are tens of thousands of poems composed on these walls. They are all cries of complaint and sadness. The day that I am rid of this prison and attain success, I must remember this chapter once existed. Since my imprisonment here, the moon is once again waxed full. I still do not know when I will be interrogated. Family poverty forced me to come and endure hardships. It is difficult to pour out all of the anger and grief in my heart. If I could land after one interrogation, it would be a slight mitigation of the barbarians' 100 oppressions. The island was closed as a detention center after the main office burned down in 1940. Much of the poetry had been written on the walls of that building and was lost. The outer buildings survived and have preserved the experience of those who persevered under such adversity. The story of Lee Puey You is both common and unique in the context of the more than 175,000 Chinese immigrants that passed through Angel Island. Of all those who passed through Angel Island, Lee's stay of almost 2 years stands as one of the longest recorded at the detention center. Lee was born in Chaotao village in the Guangdong province in 1916. She immigrated to the United States in 1939 when she was about 20 years old by posing as the daughter of an American citizen. Her family planned to have her marry a Chinese immigrant that had been selected prior to her leaving, and on arrival, would prepare the way for the rest of her family. Unlike many of the immigrants that passed through Angel Island, Lee was well educated and prepared for the interrogation that she would face at Angel Island before being granted entry. Expecting to only be held for a few weeks, she was surprised when discrepancies between her interview and the interview of who had posed as her father resulted in her being denied entry. As she was being held at Angel Island, the man that had posed as her father and his family hired lawyers to get her admitted to the United States. Her case eventually made it to the Supreme Court only to be rejected. Facing deportation, she hoped that the rising tensions between the US and Japan, as well as the war in China, would prevent them from deporting her in 1941. However, her hopes didn't fall through, and she was deported to Hong Kong, 6 years later, in 1947, she returned to the United States to marry the same man and was admitted immediately. The Chinese Exclusion Act had been appealed in 1943, and Angel Island was closed in September of 1940. Despite this, the 20 months of captivity had left their mark, and decades after her time in Angel Island, she described herself as still crying and remembering when she was in the wooden buildings, being treated like a criminal.
I didn't want to come to America, but I was forced by circumstances to come.
During one of the harder moments at Angel Island, Lee wrote the following poem onto the wall of her building. From across the Pacific Ocean to America, I left my village and all my loved ones. Who would have thought that I would be imprisoned in this wooden barrack? I do not know when I will be set free. In American history, the story and events of Angel Island should be seen as a chapter full of regret, embarrassment, and failure on the part of the US government and people to live up to their ideals. While the same story in Chinese history is also filled with regret and betrayal and sorrow, it also tells a different story. To the Chinese Americans, Angel Island can be a story of courage, of community, of persistence, and eventual triumph over adversity. Angel Island and the period of Chinese exclusion stand as a dark period that American history has to deal with, and which Chinese history and community has overcome.